At 10:20 a.m. on June 4th, 1942, over the northeastern waters of Midway Atoll, on the flight deck of the U.S. aircraft carrier USS Yorktown, William Perry squatted under the wing of an F4F Wildcat fighter, a wrench in his right hand, conducting a final inspection of the fighter's engine compartment. This was the third faulty aircraft he had checked that day. Air combat over the Midway waters had been going on for 3 hours, and the attrition rate of carrier-based aircraft was far beyond expectations. Suddenly, the air raid siren over the carrier wailed shrilly. Its piercing sound cut through the residual warmth of the engines, stinging people's eardrums. Perry looked up abruptly. His gaze passed over the carrier's island superstructure, and there, on the northeastern horizon, a formation of silver warplanes was rapidly approaching. The rising sun flag insignia on their wings glinted brightly in the sunlight. The second wave of Japanese attack aircraft was charging straight for the USS Yorktown. William Perry, a 32-year-old carrier-based aircraft mechanic aboard the USS Yorktown, had enlisted for 3 years and never received any formal flight training. His main job was to maintain the engines and avionics systems of carrier-based fighters. At this moment, the USS Yorktown he was on was becoming the primary target of Japanese warplanes. Chaos reigned on the flight deck. Ground crew pushed the yet-to-take-off warplanes to move quickly. Anti-aircraft gunners took their positions, their gun barrels aimed at the oncoming Japanese aircraft. The torpedo nets on both sides of the ship's hull were raised. Sailors scurried across the deck, running to and fro. Shouts, the roar of aircraft engines, and the pre-firing hum of anti-aircraft guns mingled, creating a chaotic chorus that heralded the arrival of death. Perry instinctively wanted to take cover in the anti-aircraft bunker below the deck. He had taken only half a step when the corner of his eye caught sight of the F4F Wildcat fighter beside him that he had just finished checking. Its fuselage was covered with bullet holes, the outer shell of the engine compartment was visibly damaged, and the fault light on the instrument panel flickered faintly. An hour earlier, the fighter squadron had declared this aircraft unable to take off normally due to insufficient engine power and to be scrapped after the battle. It was also the only fighter on the deck that had not been pushed into the hangar and remained in a startup state. By this time, all the carrier-based fighter squadrons of the USS Yorktown had taken off, forming a defensive perimeter around the carrier. However, facing the 36-strong Japanese attack formation, which included 24 Aichi, D-3A Valdive bombers, and 12 Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters, gaps had appeared in the U.S. defensive perimeter. Perry clearly saw 3 Japanese D-3A dive bombers break through the outer defense and dive toward the carrier's deck at an almost vertical angle. The black bomb bodies were exposed under their wings. The carrier's anti-aircraft guns opened fire fiercely, and a curtain of fire created white smoke around the Japanese planes. But the Japanese aircraft were diving at such a high speed that they were less than 1,000 meters away from the deck. No operational aircraft left. The defensive gap is too big. The broadcast from the deck control tower roared with despair. Perry's heart skipped a beat. He knew that once the Japanese bombs hit the deck, the USS Yorktown would suffer a devastating blow, and all personnel on the deck would be buried at the bottom of the sea. As a mechanic, Perry knew the structure of the F4F Wildcat fighter like the back of his hand. The root cause of the breakdown of this scrapped fighter was a clogged fuel pump in the engine, which led to insufficient power output. He had located the fault during his inspection just now, but he did not have the appropriate replacement parts on hand to make a complete repair. Starting it by force might keep it running for a few minutes. The thought flashed through his mind like lightning. Without the slightest hesitation, he threw away the wrench and scrambled into the fighter's cockpit. The cockpit was cramped and covered in grease. The needles on the instrument panel swung erratically. Perry had never officially piloted a warplane. He had only briefly taxied on the deck a few times during routine maintenance to test engine performance, and he knew nothing about air combat tactics. He gripped the control stick tightly with both hands and quickly recalled the steps he had observed pilots use to start the fighter. First, open the fuel valve, then press the ignition switch and pull the throttle lever at the same time. The engine let out a dull roar, followed by a harsh squeal. The fault light on the instrument panel flickered more intensely. Gritting his teeth, Perry adjusted the throttle lever slightly and punched the outer shell of the engine compartment with his fist, a habit he had developed during maintenance. Unexpectedly, it worked this time. The engine's roar gradually stabilized. Although its power was still insufficient, it could drive the propeller to rotate normally. "It started!" A ground crew member on the deck shouted in surprise at the sight. Perry had no time to pay attention to the commotion around him. He pushed the control stick forward, and the fighter began to taxi on the bumpy deck. The oncoming sea breeze, mixed with the smell of gunpowder, stung his eyes. The flight deck of the USS Yorktown was only 200 meters long, which was a struggle for a fighter with insufficient power. Perry stared intently at the end of the deck, increasing the throttle continuously. The fighter accelerated faster and faster. All the ground crew on the deck watched him nervously. Some even shouted, "Pull up! Pull up quickly!" Just as the fighter was about to rush off the deck, Perry pulled the control stick hard backward. The fighter's nose lifted slowly, and the landing gear under the wings retracted smoothly. Although the fuselage was still shaking constantly, it did take off successfully. He let out a long breath, but then felt a strong sense of weightlessness. This was his first real flight, and his body could not adapt at all. At this moment, the Japanese dive bombers had already finished dropping their bombs. 2 out of 3 bombs hit the deck of the USS Yorktown, triggering violent explosions. Flames and thick smoke soared into the sky. Perry piloted the fighter through the smoke, his visibility severely impaired. Suddenly, a Zero fighter spotted this uninvited guest and immediately changed direction to pounce on him. The Zero fighter was far more maneuverable than the F4F Wildcat, especially dominating in low-altitude dogfights. Perry had no idea how to evade. He could only push the control stick by instinct, and the fighter drew an irregular arc in the air. The Zero fighter's cannons opened fire. Bullets whistled past Perry's fighter. The left wing of the fuselage was hit, leaving a big hole. The pointer of the oil pressure gauge on the instrument panel dropped to 0 instantly. Perry's heart was in his mouth. He knew that the fighter's fuel might leak at any time, and he had to get rid of the enemy as soon as possible. He remembered what pilots used to say during his maintenance work. The F4F Wildcat's advantage lay in its diving speed. Although it was not very maneuverable, it could pull away by diving. So he pushed the control stick hard forward, and the fighter began to dive rapidly, gaining more and more speed. The Zero fighter chased closely behind, but due to the excessive diving angle, the Zero's fuselage began to show signs of instability. Seizing this opportunity, Perry pulled the control stick hard when diving to the lowest point, and the fighter shot upward suddenly. The Zero fighter, because of its excessive speed, could not adjust its direction in time and rushed to the front of Perry's fighter. This was an excellent opportunity to attack. Although Perry had never used the weapons on the fighter, he knew that the F4F Wildcat was equipped with 4 12.7mm caliber Browning machine guns, and the ammunition boxes were just below the cockpit. He fumbled to find the machine gun firing button and pressed it without hesitation. Rat-a-tat-tat! The machine guns fired continuously. Bullets hit the fuselage of the Zero fighter accurately. The Zero's engine emitted thick smoke instantly, and the fuselage began to lose control, spinning and falling toward the sea. Perry couldn't believe he had successfully shot down a Japanese fighter. He froze for a few seconds, then saw another Japanese Aichi D-3A Valdive bomber preparing to return. There were no bombs left under the fuselage, and its flight speed was relatively slow. Without thinking, Perry chased after it in his damaged fighter and pressed the machine gun firing button again. This time, the bullets hit the tail of the dive bomber. The fighter lost its balance and finally crashed into the sea. At this moment, Perry's fighter was already severely damaged. The roar of the engine became weaker and weaker. The oil pressure gauge dropped to 0 completely. The fuselage began to shake constantly, and it was on the verge of crashing. He glanced at the USS Yorktown below. The carrier was shrouded in thick smoke, and the fire on the deck was still spreading, but the Japanese attack formation had begun to retreat. Perry knew his mission was accomplished. He had won valuable protection time for the carrier, and now he needed to return as soon as possible. He adjusted his direction and flew toward the deck of the USS Yorktown. Due to the insufficient engine power of the fighter, he could not land smoothly and had to make a forced landing. When the fighter taxied on the deck, the left landing gear suddenly broke, and the fuselage flipped over. It slid dozens of meters before stopping. Perry was knocked unconscious by the huge impact. When he woke up, he had been dragged out of the cockpit by ground crew. His body was covered with wounds, but he was still conscious. He looked up at the sky. The Japanese fighters had disappeared from the horizon. Although the USS Yorktown was severely damaged, it did not sink. Sailors on the deck were trying their best to put out the fire. The sound of anti-aircraft gunfire had stopped, leaving only the crackling of burning flames and people's shouts. Perry, a mechanic who had never received formal flight training, piloted a fighter declared scrapped to fight in a desperate situation and successfully shot down 2 Japanese fighters. His deed quickly spread on the USS Yorktown. But at this moment, Perry did not realize that his action not only won valuable protection time for the USS Yorktown, but also filled the combat power gap of the U.S. carrier-based aircraft unit at a critical juncture of the Battle of Midway. In this battle, as the turning point of the Pacific War, was quietly changing the direction of the entire war situation. Why did the Battle of Midway become the turning point of the Pacific War? How many troops did the U.S. and Japan deploy in this battle? What are the performance characteristics of the F4F Wildcat fighter piloted by Perry? Let's turn back the clock to before the outbreak of the Battle of Midway and sort out the historical background of this battle. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese Navy launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, and the Pacific War broke out in full swing. In the following 6 months, relying on its powerful naval and air forces, Japan made a series of victories in the Pacific battlefield, successively occupying the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, Guam, and many other strategic locations, and controlling most of the waters in the Western Pacific. By May 1942, Japan's expansion momentum reached its peak. To further consolidate its hegemony in the Pacific and destroy the U.S. counterattack base in the Central Pacific, Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander-in-chief of the Japanese Combined Fleet, formulated the Battle of Midway plan codenamed Operation MI. Isoroku Yamamoto's strategic intention was very clear: to use Midway Atoll as bait to lure the main force of the U.S. Pacific Fleet into battle, and then concentrate the superior forces of the Japanese Combined Fleet to annihilate it in one fell swoop. Midway Atoll is located in the central Pacific Ocean, about 2,800 nautical miles away from San Francisco, USA, and about 2,400 nautical miles away from Tokyo, Japan. It is an important U.S. military base in the Central Pacific and a transportation hub for the U.S. to reach Asia and the Pacific Islands. Once Japan occupied Midway Atoll, it could not only push the U.S. defense line westward by thousands of nautical miles, but also use it as a base to threaten the security of the U.S. mainland and provide support for Japan's subsequent operations in the Southern Pacific. To achieve this strategic goal, Japan dispatched an unprecedentedly large number of troops. In the entire Battle of Midway, the Japanese Combined Fleet dispatched more than 200 warships, including 8 aircraft carriers, 11 battleships, 22 cruisers, 65 destroyers, 21 submarines, and more than 400 various carrier-based aircraft. The Japanese fleet was divided into 6 tactical formations. The main body, personally commanded by Isoroku Yamamoto, consisted of 3 battleships, 1 aircraft carrier, 2 cruisers, and 12 destroyers, responsible for overall command. The first mobile force, commanded by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, consisted of 4 aircraft carriers, Akagi 1936, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 12 destroyers, and 261 carrier-based aircraft, which was the main attack force of Japan. The Midway Attack Force, commanded by Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo, consisted of 1 aircraft carrier, 2 battleships, 8 cruisers, and 21 destroyers, responsible for directly attacking Midway Atoll. The Northern Force, commanded by Vice Admiral Boshiro Hosogaya, consisted of 2 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 2 cruisers, and 21 destroyers, responsible for directly attacking Midway Atoll. The Northern Force, commanded by Vice Admiral Boshiro Hosogaya, consisted of 2 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 2 cruisers, and 21 destroyers, responsible for directly attacking Midway Atoll. to divert U.S. forces. The submarine force, commanded by Vice Admiral Teruhisa Komatsu, consisted of 21 submarines, responsible for setting up a warning line around Midway Atoll to monitor the movements of the U.S. fleet. The supply force was responsible for providing fuel and supplies for each combat formation. Compared with Japan's massive military strength, the U.S. forces in the Battle of Midway were relatively weak, but they were well prepared and had accurate intelligence. After learning of Japan's Midway operation plan, Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, quickly adjusted the U.S. defense deployment. The U.S. dispatched a total of 76 warships, including 3 aircraft carriers, USS Yorktown, USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, 8 cruisers, 14 destroyers, 19 submarines, and 233 various carrier-based aircraft. In addition, 127 shore-based aircraft were deployed at the Midway base. The U.S. force deployment was divided into 2 main parts. The Carrier Task Force was commanded by Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher and Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, respectively. Fletcher commanded the USS Yorktown Carrier Task Force, and Spruance commanded the USS Enterprise and USS Hornet Carrier Task Forces. The 2 task forces lurked in the waters northeast of Midway Atoll, ready to ambush the Japanese fleet. The shore-based troops and aircraft at the Midway base were responsible for holding their positions, diverting the Japanese attack force, and providing intelligence support for the Carrier Task Force. The outcome of the Battle of Midway largely depended on the pre-war intelligence game. The key reason why the U.S. was able to defeat a stronger enemy was its success in cracking Japan's codes. In April 1942, the Intelligence Department of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, led by Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort, successfully cracked the code system of the Japanese combined fleet and could accurately intercept and decode Japanese radio communications. Through the analysis of Japanese communications, Rochefort's team found that the code name AF frequently appeared in Japanese communications in recent days. After repeated research and verification, they determined that AF was Midway Atoll. To further confirm this judgment, the U.S. adopted a clever plan. Let the Midway base deliberately send a message in plain code saying, "The freshwater purification equipment is faulty and urgently needs fresh water." Soon after, the U.S. intercepted a Japanese communication that mentioned AF is short of fresh water. This verification completely confirmed that AF was Midway Atoll and also allowed the U.S. to fully grasp Japan's Midway operation plan, including key information such as the operation time, troop deployment, and attack route. The intelligence advantage put the U.S. in an active position, but the U.S. also faced a serious problem. The combat readiness of the carrier-based aircraft unit was poor, and the attrition risk was extremely high. Before the outbreak of the Battle of Midway, the U.S. had just experienced the Battle of the Coral Sea. Although it successfully prevented Japan from occupying Port Moresby in this battle, it also paid a heavy price. The USS Yorktown was hit by Japanese bombs in the Battle of the Coral Sea, and the hull was severely damaged. 2 big holes were blown in the deck, and the boilers were also damaged. According to the conventional maintenance cycle, it would take at least 3 months to repair. But to participate in the Battle of Midway, Nimitz ordered the emergency repair of the USS Yorktown. The shipyard workers worked day and night and finally completed the emergency repair in only 72 hours, allowing the USS Yorktown to barely participate in the battle. In addition to the damage to the aircraft carrier, the attrition of U.S. carrier-based aircraft was also very serious. In the Battle of the Coral Sea, the U.S. lost 66 carrier-based aircraft, and many experienced pilots were killed or injured. The newly supplemented pilots lacked actual combat experience and had limited combat effectiveness. In addition, there were certain disadvantages in the types of U.S. carrier-based aircraft. Especially the F4F Wildcat fighter was far less maneuverable than the Japanese Zero fighter, which was a major challenge for the U.S. in air combat. The carrier-based aircraft unit of the USS Yorktown, where Perry was stationed, suffered the heaviest losses in the Battle of the Coral Sea. Only 10 of the 18 F4F Wildcat fighters in the fighter squadron could take off normally, and the rest were either shot down or needed maintenance due to faults, which laid the groundwork for Perry to have to pilot a scrapped fighter to participate in the battle later. As a carrier-based aircraft mechanic of the USS Yorktown, Perry hardly rested in the days before the outbreak of the battle. Together with other mechanics, he worked day and night to repair damaged fighters, replace engine parts, patch bullet holes in wings, and debug avionics systems. Due to the too fast attrition rate of fighters, maintenance parts were in severe shortage. Many damaged fighters could only be simply repaired and could not reach the best combat readiness state at all. The F4F Wildcat fighter that Perry inspected, which was later declared scrapped, was one of the fighters damaged in the Battle of the Coral Sea. Although it had undergone preliminary maintenance, the fuel pump fault of the engine could not be completely resolved, so it could only be parked on the deck, waiting for subsequent disposal. On June 3, 1942, the Japanese Northern Force began to attack the Aleutian Islands, officially kicking off the Battle of Midway. Isoroku Yamamoto thought that the U.S. forces had been diverted by the battle in the Aleutian Islands, so he ordered the 1st Mobile Force and the Midway Attack Force to approach Midway Atoll, ready to launch the first round of attacks on Midway Atoll. But what Isoroku Yamamoto did not know was that the U.S. had already mastered all his plans through intelligence. The USS Enterprise and USS Hornet carrier task forces commanded by Spruance had arrived at the ambush position in the waters northeast of Midway Atoll in advance, and the USS Yorktown carrier task force commanded by Fletcher also arrived later. The 3 carrier task forces formed an encirclement of the Japanese 1st Mobile Force. At 4:30 a.m. on June 4th, Chuichi Nagumo ordered the carrier-based aircraft of the 1st Mobile Force to take off to launch the first round of attacks on Midway Atoll. A total of 108 Japanese carrier-based aircraft formed the attack formation, including 36 Aichi-D 3A Val dive bombers, 36 Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers, and 36 Mitsubishi. A 6 M0 fighters flying toward Midway Atoll. The U.S. radar at the Midway base soon detected the Japanese attack formation and immediately sounded the air raid siren. All shore-based aircraft took off to engage in battle. Although the number of U.S. shore-based aircraft was not small, their combat effectiveness was limited. They suffered heavy losses in air combat with Japanese Zero fighters and were soon broken through by the Japanese defense. At 6:30 a.m., the Japanese attack formation arrived over Midway Atoll and launched fierce bombing on the airfield, ammunition depots, oil depots, and other targets on Midway Atoll, and the Midway base was engulfed in flames. After the first round of attacks, the commander of the Japanese attack formation reported to Chuichi Nagumo, "The defensive facilities on Midway Atoll have not been completely destroyed, and a second round of attacks is needed." At this moment, Chuichi Nagumo was faced with a difficult choice: whether to immediately dispatch the second round of attack formation to continue attacking Midway Atoll, or to replace the torpedoes on the torpedo bombers originally loaded with bombs to prepare for the possible emergence of the U.S. Carrier Task Force. Just as Chuichi Nagumo was hesitating, U.S. shore-based bombers began to launch attacks on the Japanese 1st Mobile Force. Although these attacks did not cause substantial damage to the Japanese aircraft carriers, they also made Chuichi Nagumo realize that U.S. resistance was far more tenacious than expected. Finally, Chuichi Nagumo decided to launch a second round of attacks and ordered the replacement of torpedoes with bombs on the torpedo bombers. Japanese ground crew immediately got busy. The deck was piled with bombs and torpedoes, and the scene was chaotic. At this moment, the U.S. Carrier Task Force had already discovered the position of the Japanese 1st Mobile Force. Spruance and Fletcher ordered all carrier-based aircraft to take off to attack the Japanese aircraft carriers. At 9:25 a.m., the carrier-based aircraft of the U.S. USS Enterprise and USS Hornet arrived over the Japanese 1st Mobile Force first and began to attack the Japanese aircraft carriers. Since most of the Japanese Zero fighters were escorting the second round of attack formation, and the deck was piled with flammable and explosive ammunition, the Japanese defense fell into chaos. At 10:20 a.m., when Perry was inspecting the fighter on the deck of the USS Yorktown, the U.S. attack had achieved initial results. The Japanese aircraft carriers Akagi and Kaga were hit one after another, triggering violent explosions. But Japan did not collapse. The carrier-based aircraft unit of the Japanese aircraft carrier Hiryu began to launch counterattacks on U.S. aircraft carriers, which was the origin of the Japanese attack formation that Perry faced. At this moment, the battlefield situation had entered the most critical moment. Although the U.S. had the intelligence advantage, Japan's counterattack was still very fierce. As the only U.S. aircraft carrier still in normal operation, the USS Yorktown became the core target of Japanese attacks, which also made the deck where Perry was located one of the most dangerous places in the entire Battle of Midway. Next, we will refocus on Perry, restore the complete process of him piloting the scrapped fighter to participate in the battle in detail, and analyze the tactics and equipment game in this key air battle. At 10:21 a.m., the air raid siren on the deck of the USS Yorktown was still wailing. The F4F Wildcat fighter piloted by Perry had just taken off by force, and the fuselage was still shaking violently due to insufficient power. At this moment, the roar of the commander of the U.S. fighter squadron came from the cockpit communicator. "Attention! 0 fighters are approaching from the 3 o'clock direction. Repeat, 3 o'clock direction." Perry did not understand the position corresponding to the 3 o'clock direction at all. He could only look around with his naked eyes and soon saw the silver-gray 0 fighter pouncing like a hungry wolf. Here we need to insert a set of key equipment data comparison to make us more aware of the technical gap Perry was facing. The F4F Wildcat fighter piloted by Perry was the main carrier-based fighter of the U.S. at that time. It had a length of 8.76 meters, a wingspan of 11.58 meters, an empty weight of 2,610 kilograms, and a maximum takeoff weight of 3,855 kilograms. Its power unit was a Pratt & Whitney R1830-86 radial piston engine with a normal power of 1,200 horsepower, a maximum level flight speed of 515 kilometers per hour, a service ceiling of 11,580 meters, and a range of 1,239 kilometers. The weapon configuration included 4 12.7mm Browning M2 heavy machine guns, each with 240 rounds of ammunition, and it could carry 2 45-kilogram bombs or 6 60-pound rockets. The Japanese 0 fighter chasing him was the A6M2 model, which was the most maneuverable carrier-based fighter in the Pacific battlefield at that time. It had a length of 9.06 meters, a wingspan of 12 meters, an empty weight of 1,680 kilograms, and a maximum takeoff weight of 2,674 kilograms. Its power unit was a Nakajima Sakai 12 radial piston engine with a power of 950 horsepower, a maximum level flight speed of 533 kilometers per hour, a service ceiling of 10,000 meters, and a range of 2,222 kilometers. The weapon configuration included 2 7.7mm machine guns and 2 20mm cannons, with firepower far stronger than that of the F4F Wildcat, and its maneuverability was particularly outstanding, capable of easily performing various high-difficulty evasive maneuvers in low-altitude dogfights. From the data point of view, the F4F Wildcat was comprehensively inferior to the 0 fighter in terms of power, speed, maneuverability, and firepower. Its only advantage was its strong fuselage structure and better protection performance. The cockpit was equipped with bulletproof glass and armor plates, and the fuel tank adopted a self-sealing design, which could resist enemy fire attacks to a certain extent. This advantage became Perry's lifesaver in the subsequent air battle. Back to the air combat scene. At 10:22 a.m., the 0 fighter had approached to less than 300 meters away from Perry's fighter, and the cannons began to spit fire. Rat-a-tat-tat, boom boom. 7.7mm machine gun bullets and 20mm cannon shells came alternately. The left wing of Perry's fighter was directly hit, an armor plate was lifted off, and the glass on the left side of the cockpit was also cracked by the shock. Perry instinctively slammed the control stick to the left. The fighter suddenly tilted to the left, successfully avoiding the subsequent strafing. This evasive maneuver was completely an instinctive reaction, but it accidentally conformed to the tactical characteristics of the F4F Wildcat. Although it was not maneuverable, it had strong fuselage stability, suitable for large-scale linear evasion. The 0 fighter pilot obviously did not expect this Wildcat to make such a clumsy but effective evasion. After a short adjustment of direction, he launched another attack. At this moment, a tip from another U.S. pilot came from Perry's cockpit communicator. "Use diving to get rid of it. The Wildcat's diving speed is faster than the Zero's. Perry immediately recalled the experience during his usual maintenance work. The F4F had a higher wing loading than the Zero, and it was not easy to lose control when diving. He pushed the control stick hard forward, and the fighter dived downward at an angle of 60 degrees. The speed exceeded 600 kilometers per hour in an instant, and the airflow around the fuselage made a shrill howl. As expected, the chasing Zero fighter had problems. Due to the excessive diving speed, the fuselage began to shake violently, and the pilot had to slow down to evade. Seizing this gap, Perry pulled the control stick hard when diving to an altitude of 800 meters, and the fighter shot upward suddenly. This tactical maneuver of diving climbing was a simplified version of the thatch weave, the core tactics summarized by U.S. pilots to counter Zero fighters, relying on the structural strength advantage of the F4F to break the maneuverability suppression of the Zero. Although Perry did not understand the tactical principle, he accurately completed this series of maneuvers, relying on the mechanic's familiarity with the fighter structure. At 10:23 a.m., Perry's fighter climbed to an altitude of 1,200 meters, and the Zero fighter was left behind by about 500 meters. At this moment, he finally had the opportunity to observe the overall battlefield situation. The fire on the deck of the USS Yorktown was still spreading. The positions hit by two Japanese bombs had formed two huge craters, and sailors were trying their best to put out the fire with fire hoses and carbon dioxide fire extinguishers. In the sky, US F4F fighters were intertwined with Japanese Zero and D3A fighters. Warplanes were constantly hit and fell into the sea with thick smoke, and the sea surface was already floating with the wreckage of many warplanes. Suddenly, Perry found that three Japanese Aichi D3A Val dive bombers were approaching from the starboard direction of the USS Yorktown. These were the remaining forces of the second wave of Japanese attack formation that had slipped through the net. Although there were no bombs left under the fuselage, they were still trying to attack the anti-aircraft positions on the carrier deck with machine guns. Without the slightest hesitation, Perry pushed the control stick and flew toward one of the dive bombers. The maneuverability of the Aichi D-3A Val dive bomber was far inferior to that of the Zero, which greatly reduced Perry's operational pressure. Here we add a set of key data of the Japanese Aichi D-3A Val dive bomber. This model had a length of 10.2 meters, a wingspan of 14.37 meters, an empty weight of 3,410 kilograms, and a maximum takeoff weight of 5,200 kilograms. Its power unit was a Mitsubishi Kinsei 43 radial piston engine, with a power of 1,300 horsepower, a maximum level flight speed of 428 kilometers per hour, a service ceiling of 10,500 meters, and a range of 1,800 kilometers. The weapon configuration included three 7.7mm machine guns, and it could carry one 800-kilogram bomb. It was the main attack model of Japanese aircraft carriers, with high dive accuracy but weak defense, and the fuselage had almost no armor protection. At 10:24 a.m., the fighter piloted by Perry approached to about 400 meters away from the Japanese dive bomber. He gripped the control stick tightly with both hands, and the gun sight was aimed at the engine compartment of the enemy aircraft. This was the part he was most familiar with during his usual fighter maintenance work, and he knew it was the most vulnerable key node. He took a deep breath and pressed the machine gun firing button. The four 12.7mm Browning heavy machine guns opened fire at the same time. The orange bullet chains drew clear trajectories in the air and hit the engine compartment of the Japanese bomber accurately. Boom! The engine of the Japanese bomber exploded instantly, emitting thick smoke. The fuselage lost control and began to fall toward the sea. Perry had no time to celebrate and immediately adjusted his direction to aim at the second Japanese dive bomber. The pilot of this bomber found Perry's attack and tried to evade, but the maneuverability of the Aichi D-3A Val was no match for the F4F at all. Perry pulled the trigger again, and the bullets hit the tail of the bomber. The tail structure was completely broken, and the fighter fell into the sea like a kite with a broken string. Just as Perry shot down the second Japanese bomber, the Zero fighter that had been left behind chased up again, and the cannons directly hit the engine compartment of Perry's fighter. Buzz! Crack! The engine made a shrill noise, and the speed dropped rapidly. The rotation of the propeller became slower and slower. Perry looked down at the instrument panel and found that the pointer of the oil pressure gauge had dropped to 0, and the water temperature gauge had soared to the red line area in an instant. The engine was completely scrapped. At 10:25 a.m., Perry's fighter lost power and began to glide in the air. He tried to restart the engine and pressed the ignition switch many times, but only heard a dull click sound. At this moment, the instruction from the USS Yorktown tower came from the cockpit communicator. Unknown identity fighter, return immediately. Repeat, return immediately. Perry knew that he had to land on the carrier deck as soon as possible, otherwise the fighter would crash into the sea. He adjusted the fuselage attitude and made the fighter fly toward the USS Yorktown in a gliding state. At this moment, the fire on the carrier deck had been initially controlled, but there was still a lot of thick smoke and accumulated water, and the landing area was extremely narrow. What was more dangerous was that the left landing gear of the fighter had been hit during the previous air battle, and it could only land relying on the right landing gear and the tailwheel. Perry recalled the steps he had observed pilots landing, constantly adjusting the altitude and speed of the fighter, trying to keep the fuselage stable. At 10:26 a.m., Perry's fighter arrived over the deck of the USS Yorktown at an altitude of about 50 meters from the deck. He slowly lowered the right landing gear and the tailwheel and adjusted the nose to align with the landing runway of the deck. As the fighter continued to descend, the arresting cables on the deck were clearly visible. This was the key equipment for carrier-based aircraft to land, which could pull the tail hook of the fighter through the cables to stop it in a short distance. But the tail hook of this scrapped fighter, piloted by Perry, had already been damaged in the Battle of the Coral Sea and could not hook the arresting cables at all. "I have to make a forced landing." Perry gritted his teeth and slammed on the brakes the moment the fighter touched the deck. Bang! The right landing gear collided violently with the deck, making a loud noise, and the fuselage tilted to the left instantly. Without the restraint of the arresting cables, the fighter taxied quickly on the deck. The left wing rubbed against the deck, drawing a string of sparks, and finally stopped in front of the anti-collision barrier at the end of the deck, with the fuselage flipped over. At 10:27 a.m., the ground crew on the deck rushed up immediately, pried open the deformed cockpit cover with crowbars, and dragged the unconscious Perry out. After a simple inspection, Perry had multiple abrasions and fractures on his body, but his vital signs were stable. At this moment, the second wave of Japanese attack formation had all retreated. Although the USS Yorktown was severely damaged, it successfully resisted this fatal attack. According to post-battle statistics, this wave of Japanese attack formation dropped a total of 6 bombs, 2 of which hit the USS Yorktown, killing 26 sailors and injuring 46 others, and the deck takeoff and landing function was temporarily lost. In this 6-minute air battle, relying on his familiarity with the F4F fighter structure and instinctive reactions, Perry successfully shot down 2 Japanese fighters, 1 Zero fighter and 1 Ichid-3A Val dive bomber, filling the key gap in the air defense of the USS Yorktown. It is worth noting that Perry's achievement was not an isolated case, but an epitome of the U.S. defeating a stronger enemy with a weaker force in the Battle of Midway. At the same time as Perry's air battle, the U.S. carrier-based aircraft unit was launching a fatal attack on the Japanese aircraft carrier Hiryu. At 10:30 a.m., the carrier-based aircraft formation of the U.S. USS Enterprise arrived over the Japanese aircraft carrier Hiryu. At this moment, the ground crew on the deck of the Hiryu were replenishing fuel and ammunition for the carrier-based aircraft, completely unprepared for the U.S. attack. The U.S. SBD Dauntless dive bombers began to dive from an altitude of 4,000 meters and drop bombs accurately. 4 1,000-pound bombs hit the deck of the Hiryu, triggering violent serial explosions. The fuel and ammunition on the deck were ignited, and flames soared into the sky. At around 11 a.m., the power system of the Hiryu was completely paralyzed, and the hull began to tilt. The captain ordered the abandonment of the ship. So far, all 4 aircraft carriers of the Japanese First Mobile Force had been sunk by the U.S., and the battlefield situation of the Battle of Midway was completely reversed. At this moment, Perry had been transferred to the medical cabin of the USS Yorktown. When he woke up, his first sentence was, "How is the fighter? Can it still be repaired?" When he learned that the scrapped fighter had been completely destroyed, he showed a trace of regret. That was the fighter he had maintained for a whole year. At 12:30 p.m., Admiral Nimitz of the U.S. Pacific Fleet received a joint battle report from Spruance and Fletcher. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers have been sunk, 171 carrier-based aircraft have been shot down. Our side has lost 1 aircraft carrier. The USS Yorktown later sank due to serious injuries. 98 carrier-based aircraft and 307 people have been killed. This battle report marked the end of the core naval battle stage of the Battle of Midway, and the U.S. achieved a decisive victory. And the deed of Perry piloting the scrapped fighter to participate in the battle also spread throughout the entire Pacific Fleet with the transmission of the battle report. It should be emphasized that Perry's participation in the battle was not accidental, but an inevitable result of the serious attrition of the U.S. carrier-based aircraft unit. According to post-battle statistics, in the Battle of Midway, the carrier-based aircraft units of the 3 U.S. aircraft carriers launched a total of 416 sorties, lost 98 aircraft with an attrition rate as high as 23.5%. 62 pilots were killed and 24 were injured, among which experienced veteran pilots accounted for more than 40%. In this case, mechanics familiar with fighter structures like Perry became an important supplement to the temporary combat power. In addition to Perry, 3 other U.S. mechanics piloted damaged fighters to participate in the battle during the campaign. Although they did not achieve shooting down records, they also contributed to the carrier's air defense. At around 3 p.m., the fire on the USS Yorktown spread again, and the hull tilt angle reached 25 degrees. Rear Admiral Fletcher ordered all personnel to abandon the ship. Perry was transferred to the escort destroyer USS Hammond. He stood on the deck of the destroyer, looking at the USS Yorktown shrouded in thick smoke, with mixed emotions in his heart. This aircraft carrier was his home and also the battlefield where he showed his courage. On June 7th, the USS Yorktown was finally sunk by a Japanese submarine torpedo attack in the waters northeast of Midway Atoll, becoming the only U.S. aircraft carrier lost in the Battle of Midway. Perry's core combat deeds come to an end here, but the impact of this battle has just begun. Next, we will deeply analyze the key factors of victory and defeat in Perry's cross-disciplinary combat from the tactical and strategic levels, as well as the far-reaching impact of the Battle of Midway on the Pacific War and even the entire World War II pattern. First of all, we review the key factors of victory and defeat in Perry's cross-disciplinary combat from the tactical level. The core reasons why Perry, as a mechanic who had not received formal flight training, was able to pilot a scrapped fighter to shoot down 2 Japanese fighters were threefold. First, his extreme familiarity with the fighter structure. Perry was long responsible for the maintenance of F4F Wildcat fighters, accurately mastering the fault points and structural advantages of the fighters. For example, he knew the temporary solution to the clogged engine fuel pump and understood the characteristics of the F4F's strong fuselage and stable diving performance, which allowed him to start the fighter by force in an emergency and complete the effective tactical maneuver of diving climbing by instinct. Second, the objective help of the battlefield environment. The timing of Perry's participation in the battle coincided with the Japanese attack formation, finishing dropping bombs and preparing to return. The Aichi D-3A Valdive bombers had poor maneuverability and weak defense, providing him with attackable targets. At the same time, the tactical tips from other U.S. pilots also provided key guidance for him to get rid of the Zero fighter's pursuit. Third, the protection advantage of the F4F fighter. Compared with the Zero fighter's design defect of prioritizing maneuverability over protection, the F4F's bulletproof armor and self-sealing fuel tank allowed Perry to continue fighting despite being hit multiple times, which was an important guarantee for him to achieve shooting down records and return successfully. From the tactical details of equipment comparison, Perry's achievements also confirmed the differences in the design concepts of U.S. and Japanese carrier-based aircraft. The Japanese Zero fighter pursued extreme maneuverability and range, but sacrificed protection performance, resulting in it being prone to losing control during high-speed diving and extremely easy to crash once hit. While the US F4F fighter, although not maneuverable enough, had a strong structure and stable firepower, which was more suitable for playing a role in high-intensity carrier air defense operations. This difference in design concepts had a far-reaching impact throughout the Battle of Midway. Although Japan occupied an advantage in single aircraft dogfights relying on Zero fighters, the U.S. finally gained the upper hand in the carrier-based aircraft exchange ratio, relying on the protection advantage of fighters and team tactics. According to post-battle statistics, the U.S. shot down a total of 171 Japanese carrier-based aircraft in the Battle of Midway and lost 98 of its own carrier-based aircraft, with an exchange ratio of about 1.7 to 1, among which the protection advantage of the F4F fighter contributed greatly. From a strategic level, the key to the victory of the Battle of Midway lay in the intelligence advantage and the accuracy of troop deployment. By cracking Japanese codes, the U.S. fully grasped Japan's operational plan and was able to set up an ambush in advance in the waters northeast of Midway Atoll, achieving a strategic advantage of waiting for work with ease, while Japan, due to intelligence errors, misjudged the U.S. troop deployment and response speed, leading to the first mobile force falling into the encirclement of U.S. forces. Chuichi Nagumo's wrong decision-making during the battle further exacerbated Japan's defeat. He hesitated repeatedly between attacking Midway and countering U.S. aircraft carriers, resulting in the deck being piled with flammable and explosive ammunition, giving U.S. carrier-based aircraft an opportunity to strike. Although Perry's participation in the battle was a chance tactical event, it also reflected the U.S. tactical flexibility when in a strategically passive position. When regular combat strength was insufficient, it could fully mobilize the potential of non-combat personnel to fill the gaps in combat power. Next, we analyze the post-battle impact and historical significance of the Battle of Midway. In terms of the impact on the war situation, the Battle of Midway was an important turning point in the Pacific War. In this battle, Japan lost 4 core aircraft carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, 248 carrier-based aircraft, and 3,057 officers and soldiers, including a large number of experienced pilots and ground crew. This loss dealt a heavy blow to the strength of the Japanese combined fleet, completely depriving Japan of the strategic initiative in the Pacific battlefield. After that, Japan had to shift from strategic offense to strategic defense. While the U.S. relied on this victory to stabilize the defense line in the Central Pacific, laying the foundation for subsequent counteroffensive operations, such as the Battle of Guadalcanal. In terms of the development of military technology, the Battle of Midway fully proved the central position of aircraft carriers and carrier-based aircraft in modern naval warfare, completely ending the era of battleships dominating naval warfare. During the battle, the main combat operations of both the U.S. and Japan revolved around aircraft carriers and carrier-based aircraft. The takeoff and landing efficiency of aircraft carriers, as well as the combat radius and attack accuracy of carrier-based aircraft, directly determined the outcome of the battle. After that, navies of various countries adjusted their development strategies one after another, vigorously developing aircraft carrier and carrier-based aircraft technologies, and promoting the transformation of modern navies. Perry's deed of piloting a scrapped fighter to participate in the battle also made armies of various countries realize that the professional literacy of aircraft maintenance personnel not only related to the combat readiness state of fighters, but also could be transformed into combat effectiveness in emergencies. Therefore, they strengthened the comprehensive training of mechanical maintenance personnel and improved the emergency combat capabilities of the Army. On the military psychological level, Perry's deeds greatly boosted the morale of the U.S. Army. Before the outbreak of the Battle of Midway, the U.S. suffered successive defeats in the Pacific battlefield, and a pessimistic mood pervaded the Army. As an ordinary mechanic, Perry showed courage and professional ability in a desperate situation, making U.S. soldiers see the hope of victory and stimulating the fighting will of the entire Army. After that, Perry's deeds were compiled into U.S. military training materials, becoming a typical case to encourage soldiers to stick to their posts and take responsibility bravely. On the other hand, after the defeat in the Battle of Midway, the morale of the Japanese army plummeted, and the soldiers' fighting confidence was severely hit, which also laid the groundwork for a series of subsequent failures of Japan. From the perspective of historical enlightenment, the Battle of Midway and Perry's deeds tell us that the outcome of a war depends not only on the number of troops and equipment, but also on the combined effect of various factors such as intelligence, tactics, and personnel literacy. Although the U.S. was at a disadvantage in terms of troop numbers, it finally achieved victory against a stronger enemy, relying on accurate intelligence, flexible tactics, and the emergency response capabilities of soldiers. While Japan, despite its strong military strength, finally suffered a disastrous defeat due to intelligence errors and chaotic decision-making. In addition, Perry's cross-disciplinary combat also confirmed the truth that professional literacy is the core competitiveness. No matter what position one is in, solid professional ability can play an important role at critical moments and even change the direction of the war situation. It is worth noting that after the war, Perry was not portrayed as a war hero, but returned to his job as a mechanic. For his brave performance in the Battle of Midway, he was awarded the Silver Star Medal, which was an important commendation for U.S. military personnel who fought bravely. After that, Perry continued to serve in the U.S. Navy, participating in the maintenance of carrier-based aircraft on multiple aircraft carriers, and dedicated his professional ability to the naval aviation cause. After the end of World War II in 1945, Perry retired and returned to his hometown, becoming a civil aircraft maintenance engineer and continuing to engage in the mechanical maintenance work he loved. Although his deeds were not widely spread, in the field of military history, he has become a classic case of professional personnel engaging in emergency combat and has been permanently recorded in the historical archives of the Battle of Midway. The smoke of the Battle of Midway has long dissipated, but the historical enlightenment left by this battle is still profound. It not only changed the direction of the Pacific War, but also promoted the reform of modern naval warfare concepts, shaping the naval combat mode we know today. And ordinary soldiers like Perry, with their professionalism and courage, left their own marks at the critical moment of history. Their deeds also make us understand that history is not only written by great commanders, but also co-created by countless ordinary people who stick to their posts and take responsibility bravely. If you want to know more about the military history stories of World War II, please subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell, and we will bring you more exciting content.